Hello, communicating people. I'm so happy that you're joining me today, whoever you might be. As always, my name is Abbie. This is Stories Lived, Stories Told, and here's what I know. Everything in our social world is created through communication. So that includes the stories we tell and the ones we don't, the kinds of spaces we create in our relationships, and the patterns that we make. The good news is that we have a choice in how we do all of these things. And if we work to have better communication, then we're also working to create better social worlds out of that too. I studied communication in school, but I think everyone, not just the communication scholars and academics, deserves to know this stuff because it can be life-changing. It is for me. When you start to see your life through the lens of communication, I think it just gives you an incredible perspective that isn't possible if you aren't paying attention to this stuff. So with that, let's jump right into our episode today. Today is the last episode of Season 1, which is so exciting and putting me in a reflective headspace to think back on the past year. And that's probably something you're experiencing too right now, as it is the end of the year, the end of 2022. For many of us, we are in a reflexive space to be thinking back on what the year has held and where we've been. And I'm looking back on the podcast this past year, but at the same time, I am also looking forward and starting to ask what's next. And again, I think that's a spot a lot of us are in, of we find ourselves walking this tightrope, finding this balance of looking at where we've been and at the same time looking at where we're going. It's heightened at the end of the year, but I think we're always in that kind of space. And we talk about our stories because we're living our stories right now. We're still in the middle of writing them. And at the same time that we're living them, we are looking back and trying to understand what we've been through and what it means to us. And at the same time, having to look forward and keep writing our story and trying to decide what we want for our story, what we want the rest of our story to look like. And doing all of that at the same time as still trying to be present to the story we're in the moment. And not letting the reflection of going back and looking forward to take away from that. It's a delicate balance, and we're all always doing it. For now, I would love to have one more conversation for 2022 about what else? Stories. Because they really are the kind of unit that we measure our lives through. I don't know if that's how I want to say it, but when you think about taking a perspective of communication in your life, what that really means is to be seeing life through the lens of stories and understanding how everything is a story and then how the stories shape us. So when I talk about communication as this thing that we do and as something that shapes us, what I am talking about is stories. Because that's how we communicate, through stories. We build our social worlds through stories. Everything is a story. And that might be a new way to look at things for you. But, try it out. Think of the things in your life, the things that you know, the things you've been told, the things that you've lived. How can you see them all as their own stories and part of your bigger story? We know that stories really is at the core of this because we talked about the title of the podcast and, what I hope for you when you hear that and what I want to remind myself that it means is that it's not something to take at surface level. Stories lived, stories told. The implication is that there's so much more in between that. And this comes from the LUT model, which is LUT, L-U-U-U-U-T-T, which is part of the coordinated management of meaning theory. But in the simplest of terms, this is a great way to help us understand the complexity of people, of our lives, of our social worlds, by using this model and this idea that at one end of the spectrum, you have lived stories. At the other end, you have your told stories. And then there's so much more in between. The U's standing for the untold stories, the unknown stories, the unheard stories, and the untellable stories. So, the things that we don't tell, the things that we can't tell, the things that we haven't been told yet. So there's power in acknowledging the U's, the U part of the loop model, because we can be aware, it's kind of obvious, right, that the stories that we get told shape us. It's harder work to look at how the stories that don't get told shape us. But they do, they definitely do. And the loop model is something that I think can be applied to a larger community level and a personal level too, because you have, maybe it's like a distinction between like a capital S story and a lowercase s story. If I'm saying that the capital S story is like a narrative, like a community narrative, or like a story that is collectively known from a society. Those are the like capital S stories that are told. And those are the stories that we often internalize, that a large group of people or generation of people might internalize because they've all been told the same capital S story of, what it means to be a member of that community, what their life path is supposed to look like. A number of things could be a capital S story. An example of that could be like a larger level capital S story that is something that's told is what success looks like. And in our capitalistic American society, at least, a lot of times that narrative includes financial wealth and stability, which is very important, but it looks like having, material things, having the best things, and that being a measure of success. A story that's not as much told in society, in my society at least, is, a story of success that's not based around material possessions and is based around enoughness. This may be a story of fulfillment with less, or success not even being measured by a career or what title you have or what kind of car you have or how big your house is. Because, if you see an advertisement for anything, they're definitely not going to be telling the story of you actually have enough. All the advertisements are trying to convince us that we need something else to be happy, to be fulfilled, to be successful. And advertisements maybe are a good representation of the stories that a society buys into and tells, because advertising is so prevalent and, it's something we see all the time without even thinking about it. And, like it or not, that's part of the story. So how does the fact that the story of enoughness, of being fulfilled with less, the fact that that story is an untold story, what does that do for a society? And you can maybe imagine that in your own life and think about, what if you had been told that story more, what would you not have, wasted money on, or what would you not have tried to chase so hard because you thought that it would be the thing that brought you happiness, or you thought that that meant success or fulfillment in your life. The other side of the same coin, the lowercase s side, is that this loop model also happens in a personal level. So I guess my example here is that the told story, the end of that loop model, what actually is told is, if we're talking about me at least, I'll say that maybe a told story is that I am a certain way. Maybe it's a told story in my family or among my friends that I like to be organized and I'm a planner and I like to know what's going on. I like to have control. And the untold story, though, might be why I am that way. What was my childhood like that led to me being this way? What kind of interactions did I have that taught me what was good and how I was supposed to be, and that there was value in being this tiny little adult? That could be an untold story if I choose not to share that. It still shapes the whole interaction, whether another person knows it or not, because it may be told to me, may be known to me, but it's unknown to that other person because it's not something I'm choosing to tell. The specific example that I have for this is that I am living at home with my parents for the next chunk of time after being away and doing some traveling and having one extreme of independence, now being back to being in my childhood home. And I'm really hanging on to this idea of untold or unknown stories because I have to, in a way. It's the only way for me to kind of survive this extreme change of adapting to being back at home and starting to understand my parents in a different way and looking towards having a friendship with them and knowing them as full people instead of just my parents. And I have to remember that there are a lot of untold stories that I just don't know yet that affects the way that they are, the way that they interact with me when they maybe do something that's different than I would do and I don't feel like I can understand it. You know, maybe when I ask the question of why my parents did something, I know the answer, but maybe I don't, and maybe I never will. But asking the question is what leaves the space to recognize the pull of other stories. And I think that's the core of the loop model, at least on the very basic level, is just acknowledging that those other stories even exist, and that on its own creates a huge amount of different space for the stories to be able to start to get told. But to go back to living at home with my parents, you know, I'm trying to understand better the way that they are and why they do the things that they do. And so I have to be asking why, either to them or just, you know, in my own self and in my own reflecting. You know, I can look at an interaction and say, okay, that's what happened. That's what they said, but why? And maybe I do know the answer because I know a lot of our family stories, which is kind of another version of a capital S story, you know, the narratives that get passed down in a family group. I know some of those stories, and so I can maybe use my imagination to understand why they did something. But there's a lot of times where I don't know the answer or I don't know the full answer, even if I think that I do. And so when I can remind myself that there's probably other untold stories, hurt that they're carrying with them, things that affected them in a huge way that maybe they don't even understand. If I can ask why, but not need an answer, and recognize that the asking why is what's important, then that helps me to create a different space in our relationship to understand them better. It's like when you become okay with not having the full story is when it's more likely that more of the story will come out. I feel like it kind of works that way, because if I start saying, okay, there's something else going on here in my parents, in me, in our relationship, in our dynamic, and start asking why, then that in and of itself is what creates the space for some of those untold stories to come out. And I think this is kind of a fork in the road, because there's two ways that this could go with the untold stories and how we manage them. And the two paths are, okay, how do we get those untold stories told? And the other option being, how do we get okay with leaving untold stories untold? And, you know, still acknowledging them, knowing that they might never come out. Because we're never going to make all the untold stories told. But I think it's still a worthwhile effort to do what you can in your interpersonal relationships, in your family relationships, and on a larger community level. There are untold stories in our societies that need to be told. Because what it serves to do when people get to tell their own stories is to humanize people, I think. And so if you start hearing the stories of the people that are experiencing homelessness in your community or are otherwise marginalized in some kind of way, a lot of times these untold stories come from the minority group in a culture, whether that's a minority by race, ethnicity, religion, all kinds of, you know, categories or aspects of our lives we can find ourselves in, the majority or minority of a group. And that is something that affects whether stories are told or untold, but we can, you know, seek out those stories, even if our society isn't initially conducive to bringing out those stories. So we're never going to make all the untold stories told, and that's okay. But let's think about our own stories to start with. Thinking about why our untold stories are untold. And here's an example for me. I have a relationship that's difficult to navigate, And I stopped myself from sharing about my experience of the relationship for a lot of reasons that I need to keep trying to better understand. But one is that I don't feel safe to share my story of some of the interactions that this person and I have. I don't feel that I will be heard, and so I make the decision to leave those stories untold. And that's not really the decision I want to be making, but it's where I'm at right now, and it's really hard. I want so badly to share with this person and say, hey, when we argue, when you do this thing, when this happens between us, this is what that means for me, and this is the pain that I'm still carrying into it, and this is why I maybe say that, and this is what it feels like when you do that thing. And this is one of those untold stories that needs to be told to help heal the relationship, and that's something that I just have to keep figuring out how I can make myself feel safe enough to do that, because we aren't always going to get that from the people around us. We've talked about the kind of space that we create in our relationships and to what we can do to make it be one that encourages vulnerability and safe story sharing, but that's not always easy or possible. And so we have to go back to what we can control and what we can do for ourselves to make it as safe as possible if that other person isn't able or ready to collaborate with us to do that yet. So I'm not ready to say those things. So in this meantime, what's best as a temporary thing while an untold story is yet to be told is for this other person to at least consider the fact that I do have untold stories, because they're forming their thoughts around the situation without having all the information. And I'd be doing the same if I wasn't asking to myself, okay, this person is doing this thing that is hurtful to me. I can't just see it as one-dimensional. I have to believe that this person has stories behind this action that I don't know about yet. It helps me to have more empathy for people, to see people as the product of many stories, good and bad and messy and all that. The other thing that happens in that loop model between the stories lived and the stories told, like we've talked about before, is meaning and the way that we make meaning, the way that we manage meaning, and how it affects us in return. Because it's this acknowledgement, as always, that the meaning we find in our social world and the things people say to us and the things people do is not ever innate. It's always, always, always something that we're attaching. And that's not to say that it's not real, but I think it helps us so much to recognize where it came from. And I think about arguments in any kind of relationship of someone trying to express, hey, this hurt when you did this thing, and the other person's response being, well, I didn't mean for it to hurt you. And this gets into a really interesting conversation that we call intent versus impact. You may have had the intent to not hurt someone in your actions, but the impact did hurt them. And where you go from that, that's a great recognition on its own, to recognize the difference between intent and impact and recognize you might not have intended it, it still could have been the impact. And where you have to go from that is at a certain point say, the intent is much less important than the impact. So you kind of have to move from acknowledging what the impact was, regardless of whether it was your intent or not, and go from there. And that's what this conversation would be, this argument. You did this thing that hurt me. Well, I didn't mean for it to hurt you. That's kind of a cop-out, It reaches people at an impasse. And so what I think the way through this, though, is to zoom out and to have a conversation about the meaning of those stories and where the meaning lies for each person and where the difference in the meaning is and where it comes from for each other, and recognize that they're both true in their own ways because it was the person's experience. So if we do take on this communication perspective, like I've been talking about all year, we are better able to see ourselves as the writer of our own story, as someone in the middle of their story, because, as long as you're living, you are still in the middle of your story, and you are doing that balancing act of looking back and looking forward and trying to stay present. And why I think it's so important to see yourself as the writer of your story is that when you look back, when you do that reflection, you might see some things that you're not proud of. And it's easy to get stuck and say, well, that's my story and this is who I am. But when you're the writer of your own story, you get to change that. So you can't see yourself as being at the end of your story. Maybe you're at the end of one story and you need to start writing a new story and there's a big change in your story, but there's still more to write. There's still more to live. There's still more to tell. There's still more to understand and find out about yourself. So all of this to say that the core of our communication is stories. When you better understand the role of stories, I think that the next step from there is to look at your own storytelling. What stories are you telling and what stories are you not telling and why? How can you be someone that tells the kinds of stories we need to hear more of? And for me, those are the stories that are more vulnerable to share, ones that we may feel embarrassed by and self-conscious of, but not because we have to be, but because society said we should feel shame about certain things. I think we need more stories of growth, of messing up, learning from mistakes, moving on, being resilient, struggling to do hard things. Of course, it feels easier to tell the stories that make us look good. But I think it's important to find some alignment between the stories we live and the stories we tell. And the fact is that every single one of us lives stories that are, messier, not as pretty or clean cut or more complicated. So it's worth learning how to tell those kinds of stories too, because I just think it's really important for other people to hear those stories. So we have to learn how to tell them. And, remember, this isn't the flip of a switch, but it's a slower process of learning to live and communicate differently. But, always let the goal of creating better social worlds be your guide and your inspiration. Well, that is all for this episode and for Season 1 of Stories Lived, Stories Told. Today, our next turn, which is what we can take away from this conversation and use in our own lives. This week, our next turn is to keep our eyes out for untold stories in our lives and in the lives of others, and also to remember that it enriches our lives to look for those stories and acknowledge that they exist, whether they get told or not. Remember, you are the writer of your own story, which means you have agency and a choice over what comes next and, what to do with what's already written. And also that everyone else is in their own balancing act of looking back, looking forward, and staying present. And that looks different for everyone, but we can meet people where they're at. And of course, our bonus next turn is to share this podcast with someone in your life who could use it. Personally, I believe that everyone could use this podcast and these kinds of conversations, but maybe that's a little presumptuous. Regardless, I hope that we can just keep expanding this community and welcoming more voices and unique stories into the space. So please invite someone into this conversation with us. As always, I get to do this podcast with support from the CMM Institute for Personal and Social Evolution. We share the same goals of reflecting on communication, learning the power of storytelling, and working to make better social worlds. They have a lot of other really neat initiatives like the Cosmopolis 2045 project, a few different fellowship opportunities, Cosmo Kids, and what's in the work right now, Cosmo Teens. So we'll just have to keep up with that as that project develops. You can learn more about that project at the CMM Institute website and follow their progress on their Instagram account, which is at Cosmo Teens. That's teens with a Z. I'll link these in the description so you can check out all the awesome things they're up to. If you enjoy this episode, please rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Doesn't take long to do, and it's super helpful for me to help get more people connected to the podcast, which is the goal to build this community. So follow us wherever you may be listening. That way you'll never miss an episode. I will be releasing new episodes weekly starting in February, so there'll be a lot of exciting things to look forward to. I also have a YouTube channel now, which I am slowly working to build up. Soon you'll be able to find all our episodes there and some great bonus content too. So head over there and give all those videos a big thumbs up and subscribe. Lots of big announcements today because you can also find me on Instagram now at Stories Lived, Stories Told Pod. I post daily mindful moments and give you a heads up when new episodes are coming out. In the next months, I'll also be getting up a Stories Lived, Stories Told website, so be on the lookout for that. I think that'll be a cool landing place for this community. I'll be announcing that on Instagram, so you can go check it out when it's live. And of course, you are as much a part of this podcast as I am, so pretty please DM me on Instagram, comment on YouTube, or email me to keep the dialogue alive. I love to hear your questions and ideas for the podcast. And always whatever stories you want to share, since this is the space for safe story sharing. Thank you for showing up. Thank you for being curious. Thank you for being a part of this story. We will meet again in February 2023 for the beginning of Season 2. In the meantime, go back and listen to your favorite episodes because they might hit you different now. You might learn something new again. And as always, keep creating those mindful moments wherever you can and however you can. I'm Abbie, and this has been Stories Lived, Stories Told.